in institutionalization within non-democratic regimes, and in particular, the use of law and constitutional law within non-democratic regimes. And at a high level, my research over the next few years is aimed at answering the question, why constitutional amendment? Why do non-democratic leaders utilize constitutional amendment in order to address threats to the longevity of their leadership? And that might come in many different forms. It might be as a consequence of a presidential term limit inherent to the Constitution. It might be a response to public unrest or public protest. And we've seen, respectively, examples of both of those instances in the Russian Federation in 2020, and bizarrely, and I'll come on to suggest why I think it's bizarre, in the case of Lukashenko in Belarus as we speak. And it is a common question why constitutional amendment would be used by non-democrats. And that arises from our understanding, or presumed understanding, of constitutions. Constitutional documents are often understood to be liberal democratic instruments of organizing government. That's the first assumption that often people make. And secondly, they're often seen as being instruments of constraint or restraint in government. And those two assumptions, it seems to me, and I think there's a degree of agreement about this in the scholarly literature, those two assumptions are flawed. There is nothing inherent about constitutions that renders them uniquely favourable to a liberal democratic system of government. And indeed, not only made the primary aim of a constitution not be to restrain government, but constitutionalism, the principle of restraining government by constitutional law, may not be a feature of a constitution at all, as a matter of theory. And so looking at those two principles, one can see how constitutions may exist and be of utility within a non-democratic setting. But there's also a wider paradox when we look at constitutional amendment in the non-democratic setting, which is that there is a sense in which constitutional reform is seen as granting legitimacy to government, to leadership. But that legitimacy, of course, one must assume hinges upon the constitutional foundations of the regime and the inherent legitimacy of the regime's actions. So the question arises, why use constitutional amendment if it's understood by all that the amendment is primarily there, not really as a factor of constitutional government, but as a means of augmenting power, augmenting the power of leadership? And these are some of the questions that I'm hoping to grapple with as time goes by. Very, very briefly, I wanted to touch upon my expertise in the region. Bear with me a second, there we go. So I just wanted to touch upon my expertise in law and also in the post-Soviet space. My background, as Safi says, is as a practicing lawyer. I obtained my undergraduate and postgraduate degrees in law, but I also undertook a master's in Russian studies here at UCL SSEES. And it's because of that exposure to area studies that I decided to continue with my PhD here. I'm also grateful, and I should mention this, to have the ESRC UBL Doctoral Training Partnership funding behind me, and I'm grateful for that. But moving on to questions of substance, I wanted to outline today, obviously not substantive answers to all of the questions that I've raised, but the key parameters of my research going forward. And the first question, which I've already mentioned, is why constitutional amendment? What is the unique utility of constitutional amendment to non-democratic leaders when there are alternatives, and we'll come on to look at some of those in a moment, and there are alternative strategies that might be adopted? That, of course, has to be understood within the context of constitutions in non-democratic regimes more generally. The two obviously inform one another. I want to look very briefly at my approach to the analysis, what I'm calling the tripartite analysis, which is the framework for my research into the three case studies that I'll be looking at. And I also want to look briefly at the policy outcomes that I'm driving towards, or hoping to drive towards. And this is represented in what I've called the red flag or red flag monitoring system. And finally, I want to address one consistent bugbear of mine when we're considering the impact of constitutional law within a political context. And that's what I call rules skepticism, a general skepticism about the impact of rules, as opposed to rules as another factor influencing de facto political power. And I'll hope to come on to explain that in a moment. You can see I've put up on your screen the two best mates, Lukashenko and Putin, increasingly on friendly terms, it seems, as Lukashenko's leadership becomes dependent upon the Kremlin. It will be no surprise why I've put them there. Russia embarked upon quite a bold approach to constitutional reform in 2020, and President Lukashenko is currently pursuing constitutional amendment, and an amendment that is due to be put to the public in February of 2020. And then you have Serge Sargsyan at the bottom, who was once president of Armenia, who embarked upon an attempt at constitutional amendment to augment political power and to continue his leadership, but who, unfortunately for him, failed in that endeavour and precipitated, as we all know, a revolution in April 2018 as a consequence. Now, I'll come on to explain why I use these, why I've adopted these as case studies in a moment. So let's just briefly think about constitutions. And there's a lot of literature on this, and I've chosen as a brief introduction Ginsburg and Simpson, who look at constitutions within an authoritarian context. But I want to take a step back and look at this phrase, constitutional illusions, which is a phrase used by the man who will be well known to everybody here, stood there on his podium, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Not often someone who quotes Lenin, I should stress, but in these circumstances, it's quite opposite, because he always talked about constitutions, and particularly liberal democratic constitutions, as being mere reflections of power. They didn't restrain, they didn't remold political power, they were but mere reflections of it. Thankfully, we've come quite a long way away from that position, but it was, in my submission, the de facto position within this field for a very long time, where scholars were skeptical about the value of studying constitutions and law within a non-democratic setting, if only because it was seen as an instrument that could be easily remolded, a reflection of political power, a constitutional illusion. But we know now that there are lots of different functions that constitutions can serve within a non-democratic setting. Yes, they may serve a function of window dressing. That it seems cannot be denied. So, for example, the Brezhnev Constitution of 1977 made various commitments about the rights of the 15 republics to secede from the USSR. There was no real question, at least until April 1990, when the substantive law was drafted to allow for that process. There's no real question of the republics being allowed to secede. One also can see the various statements about commitments to human rights in some of the most totalitarian regimes in the world. And inevitably, one looks at those commitments, particularly substantive and procedural human rights, and one looks at them skeptically. And that may well be window dressing, an attempt to dress up the regime as being sincere and sincerely concerned about the rights of individuals. But going beyond that, one can see that constitutions at the very basic level perform as operating manuals. If there's one role that a constitution serves, it's as a framework for and addressing organizational principles of government. And that is also true of non-democratic regimes. And we can see that where the Russian Federation's constitution identified the presidential term limits as being limited to 2 consecutive terms under the old Article 81(3) provision, that was a norm establishing a principle of government, which many individuals considered to be sacrosanct. It could be amended, but there was no real question of abrogating that by allowing a president to remain in office beyond 2 consecutive terms in the absence of amendment. And so, at its most basic, constitutions, even in a non-democratic setting, may serve as an operating manual for government. They might serve as a blueprint. Sometimes you see constitutions in non-democratic regimes making policy commitments. And that was certainly, again, true of the old Soviet constitutions. But it's also true of the Russian Federation and the amendments that were introduced in 2020, dealing with index linking of pensions and inflation. But they can also serve as billboards. And this is potentially most relevant to the analysis that I'm undertaking. What do Simpson and Ginsburg mean by billboards? Well, it identifies where power lies and thereby becomes a political advertisement within the regime for that institution. And we'll come on to how Henry Hale reinterprets that rather usefully in a moment. So why amendment? The first stage of this is to understand what the risks might be. And I want to start briefly with an experience that I've had quite commonly when I'm talking to people about my research. Particularly when I'm talking about presidential term limits, people's response is often, well, it's obvious, isn't it? You need to amend the Constitution in order to get around a term limit. That's obvious, Paul. Surely you should realise that. But of course, it's not quite as intuitive as it first seems. Let me briefly skip ahead. In relation to presidential term limits, let's zero in on term limits. Versteeg and others have written a fantastic article looking at what they call the evasion, one might call it avoidance, but the evasion of presidential term limits. And they look at some of the alternatives that might be deployed. The blank slate theory, not necessarily more helpful because it involves reconstituting the Constitution, creating a new one altogether. And one can say that that's probably somewhat more difficult. One might use judicial reinterpretation, rare, but possible, using the judiciary to reinterpret the application of presidential term limits. And that occurred a great deal after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, when questions arose about when term limits actually started to run for individuals who'd been in office, for example, such as Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan, prior to the establishment of the new independent republic. But this is a really important one, the faithful agent strategy. And I've put up Medvedev there, and I'm sure that everyone will be aware of this, because of the tandem approach that was adopted between 2008 and 2012, where Putin stepped back from the presidency, but it's commonly thought exercised a degree of control, or at the very least, ensured that somebody was in place to keep the seat warm for his return in 2012. And one might regard that as a risky strategy, but it de-risks as well, because it doesn't involve all of the things that one needs in order to amend a constitution. And amending a constitution should not be underestimated, even within a non-democratic system. Or finally, you could delay elections. But in my submission, the faithful agent strategy is likely to be a particularly attractive one to many individuals. And it's been adopted, as you've seen, of course, to some degree in Kazakhstan as well, after the protests in 2019, where Nazarbayev took a step back. Query, of course, and I will leave others who have a greater expertise in this to say whether or not that was successful in the long term, given what we're seeing in Kazakhstan at present. So I've looked at the alternatives, some of the alternatives, and the faithful agent strategy in particular has been deployed to great use in a number of former Soviet states. And I want to briefly look at this question of internal threats. And the most obvious internal threat is a term limit. I've already said why it might not be so intuitive that one embark upon a process of constitutional amendment. And I also want to stress that there are real risks that come with constitutional amendment. Inevitably, it depends upon the degree of political power that a leader wields within the regime, but nonetheless, these have to be considered. One may need constitutional majorities. And even if you have a constitutional majority, you may need to be thinking about the use of political capital with the existing constitutional majority that you have. What other agendas might you have that need greater support from, for example, your state Duma? You may want to seek endorsement by way of a referendum. It may be required by your constitution. What about circumstances where your appeal is to the public and you need a referendum, but there are still fundamental questions about your legitimacy and your electoral legitimacy? That was perhaps most true of Serge Sargsyan when he put it to a referendum in December 2015. It may generate what Benvindo and most famously Ackerman called a constitutional moment, a moment where individuals opposed to the regime coalesce and oppose these drastic, bold constitutional reform agendas. And it may be because of these risks that Versteeg and others in their article assess that there is a 40% rate of failure when looking at states that have, or leaders that have embarked upon term limit evasion since the year 2000. And by failure, they mean that the amendment wasn't fundamentally passed, that the reform didn't pass. That's all they're looking at as a measure of failure. But there are also external threats to the regime, not just internal. And we have evidence that constitutional amendment is embarked upon as a means of addressing these external threats. The most obvious one being Lukashenko's Belarus. You'll note that I said it was bizarre that Lukashenko has embarked upon this process. And why do I say that? And of course, these were preliminary thoughts, I stress. But as everyone knows, August 2020 was the presidential election in Belarus. It was widely considered to be fraudulent, and Lukashenko was widely considered to have defrauded the electorate. It led to widespread and mass protests. Within days of the emergence of these protests, Lukashenko makes a commitment, albeit one that he has made in the past, I guarantee that. He made a commitment to constitutional reform before he left. That was his commitment then. But he also made a commitment in the early part of 2021, before the Belarusian People's Assembly, to put this to a public vote, of all things, to return to the very mechanism, the electoral mechanism, that caused the process in the first place. And so I've put counterintuitive with a question mark, because it seems on its face to be a counterintuitive instrument to use, particularly if you're using a national plebiscite, in order to address the initial threat, which was public unrest. And I've called it the October Manifesto paradigm and the paradox of amendment, because it is not so dissimilar, although it has its unique features, to what was done by Tsar Nicholas II in 1905, when he acceded to demands for greater restraint on the monarchy by the establishment of the State Duma. Constitutional steps, constitutional amendment as a means of assuaging a population that was in revolt. And that seems to me is not so dissimilar to what Lukashenko is doing at present, albeit the jury is out at the moment as to how successful he will be. So I've addressed the alternatives that might be adopted. The second point that I want to make, though, when we look at why amendment, is what are the existing factors that may well lend constitutional amendment a unique utility? What can we derive from the existing literature on this that may be of use during the course of my research? Well, the first stop-off point, it seems to me, is looking at institutions and rules and their value to a non-democratic leader seeking legitimacy through legalism. This is a very post-Soviet legalistic approach to the use of norms, which I'll hope to go into in a bit more depth during the course of my research. The mimicry of accountability is what Morgan Besser sees as a fundamental feature of authoritarian innovation. And again, this is fundamentally about mimicking democratic forms of government to some degree, or at least constitutionalist forms of government. You also have this information and focal effect. You remember I spoke briefly about Henry Hale's interpretation of what I referenced as billboarding, which was a word used by Ginsburg and Simpson. And Henry Hale talks in particular about the institution of the presidential office. And he says, look, if you have a term that specifies that there is an indivisible organ of state called the president, and that identifies them as having the key power within or across three branches of government, that has an information effect because it identifies that as being an institution worthy of capture. But it also has a focal effect because it forces and encourages elite networks to coalesce around the individual occupying or most likely to occupy that office. And you also have Anne Meng's excellent book on constitutional constraint within non-democracies, within authoritarian systems of government, where she looks at how asymmetries in information between elite networks and the leader can encourage what she calls institutionalized pacts of long-term rent distribution. And it's essentially a leader seeking to amend a constitution in such a way that commits himself to these elite networks and says, look, there will be mechanisms by which you can legally get rid of me. I will accede to a request for constraint and restraint so that you know you can get rid of me legally. And that hopefully quells the demand for open mutiny. I've talked a little bit about the threats to leadership longevity. I've looked at constitutional amendment in all of the, I should say, non-democratic post-Soviet states following the dissolution of the USSR, so excluding the Baltics. And I've looked at term limits, presidential term limits, public unrest, and a combination of the two, it seems to me, as being, from that analysis, the most likely causes of constitutional amendment as a means of addressing threats to leadership longevity. There is another potential cause, which might be leadership succession and dynasty, which is something slightly different in my view. It doesn't really address threats to leadership longevity. It's much more about the stabilization of dynastic power as opposed to the leader of a single individual. This tripartite analysis is then going to be key to my work. I'm going to look at cause, whether we can actually identify what I've assessed as the preliminary cause of the amendment as being its predominant cause by reference to a rigorous analysis, a rigorous process tracing analysis. I want to look at process, and this is going to be quite a large chunk of the research. What are the common themes, the distinguishing features the process has adopted? National plebiscites, the co-optation of judiciary, what approach has been adopted to the legislature, what's the nature of and makeup of working groups, constitutional working groups, and all of this leads to an understanding of the unique utility potentially of the constitutional amendment process to the non-democratic leader. And finally, I look at outcome, and of course this is particularly critical in the case of Serge Sargsyan, where one could see how the amendment was successful, but perhaps not its obligation, its objective. The red flag system is really what I hope and intend to be the policy outcome to my research. I've put there the rule of law checklist that the Venice Commission has established. And my hope is that what I am aiming to produce is something similar that allows organizations to understand where the risks are and where constitutional amendment is being primarily used to augment rather than to constrain power. And I've put some of the examples that might emerge from the literature, but of course inevitably this is going to require a lot of work and thought in order to produce something that's an objective measure that sends red flags to NGOs and international organizations considering whether to endorse amendment or not. And briefly, I just want to talk about rules skepticism within the last remaining couple of minutes. You will note that earlier on I talked about what I thought was a consistent bugbear of mine. I recommend everybody read, if you're interested in this, and if you haven't already, Hale's book in 2015 and Anne Meng's, and I have a select bibliography at the end of this presentation. They really push the field forward by some degree. What they both say, however, which is quite common in the literature, is that we should study constitutions not because of their normative force. We're not interested really in constitutions as constitutions per se, but we're interested in them because of their effect on de facto political power. And it's the division between normative force and political power that I currently take issue with. And I want to finish on an analysis that comes from jurisprudence, and I'm hoping very much to blend jurisprudence, area studies, and political science within my research. I want briefly to light upon Herbert Hart's, H.L.A. Hart's research as a jurist in the 1960s. And he looked at the nature of rules. What are rules was the fundamental question he was asking himself. And what is law? What distinguishes rules from social habits? And he came up with these two important principles: the rule of recognition, which can be summarized as that basic rule against which the validity of all subsequent norms is derived and understood. So, for example, in the British, or I should say the United Kingdom system of government in the UK Constitution, one can say that no law is law unless it has been enacted by the Queen in Parliament. That is the fundamental basic law within this country. And in the United States, you might say that a law cannot be law, federal or state, unless it conforms with the US federal constitution. That's one principle that I want to just park for a moment. Then you have the internal aspect, and this is how individuals perceive rules. It manifests itself in a reflective, critical attitude. When I look at the rule, I reflect on my actions in relation to it. Deviation from that rule gives rise to criticism and demands for conformity, both in the self-critical attitude, but also externally from the public at large. And it gives rise to this normative language of ought, should, right, and wrong. Let's use an example. President Putin consistently said in advance of 2008, in advance of the tandem, and also in advance of the amendments in 2020, consistently said that he did not want to, and I paraphrase, mess around with the Constitution. He didn't want to play with it. He wanted to be seen to conform, to step down at the end of his second term in office in 2008. And again, the very act of amending the term limit in 2020 is an example of this, whether we like it or not, reflective, critical attitude, because it's a bright line rule at presidential term limit. The failure to comply with it gives rise to demands for conformity. And so you see the point that I'm making here is that as long as a constitutional norm is in conformity with the rule of recognition, the basic law of the country, and as long as it is law in the sense that it, in response to it, individuals have this internal aspect, it is that focus that gives rise to an obligation and that gives rise to the need to amend. And these are all theoretical preliminary observations, but they are likely to some degree or another become part of the discourse as part of my research project. And I have a selected bibliography there in case anyone wants to look at this a little bit further. It is very selective, I should say. And of course, there's a great deal more literature on this. I think I saw that Elizabeth Teague was on the line very briefly earlier, and in particular in relation to the Russian Federation constitutional amendments in 2020. Elizabeth's article on that is superb. So there's a lot of literature on this, and of course institutionalization generally, which is available for you to take a look at. I want to briefly stress that this is the start of a long road for me. I am very pleased that everybody came along today, but I'm most interested in feedback, whether or not it's on this call, through the question and answer session that's coming up, or by email. And particularly if you're looking to collaborate on these sorts of issues, I would love to hear from you. And that's all I have for today. And thanks, Safi, for your introduction. And I'll hand over to you for the Q&A if you don't mind.